Your textbook reading for today talked about, a little bit about at least, the genre of the Gospels. Thanks, Ryan. Do you remember what the authors called the Gospels? What genre would they fit in? Okay, biography, but even a little more specifically, biographical what? Biographical sermons. Sermons, right? Because yes, thank you. Yes, they recount the life of Christ, but they are also calling people to faith in Christ. So they use the term biographical sermons. We might ask the question, why 4 Gospels? Why not just one big Gospel or maybe even 2? Why 4? Can you think of some reasons why we have 4 Gospels? Cross-referencing. What do you mean by that? So there's multiple witnesses that lend to the credibility of what each author is saying, because you can check, at least with many events, you can see it also explained in another gospel. Keith, were you going to say something? Okay, multiple witnesses. Good. Caitlin. Okay, they all emphasize. They tend to emphasize different things. Although there's a lot of overlap, they tend to emphasize and highlight different things. What's your name again? Blue shirt, right there. What? Derek, thank you. Okay, so different audiences might call for different emphases or nuances. Good. Nathaniel?
Although they tell some of the same stories, they also give different perspectives on the same stories. So if you don't understand one interpretation of how the story was told, you can go to another book and steal that from the story. You gotta understand it.
Okay, yeah. Any eyewitness is going to tell things from a slightly different perspective. Okay, so you get 4 perspectives in many cases on different events. That's true of, for example, the resurrection. There's all of 4 of them have a certain core of things that are essential and central and the same, but there are also different details that are emphasized, which also lends to the credibility of the gospel. Sometimes skeptical scholars or people will point to the 4 different accounts of the Gospels and they'll say, you see, they contradict one another. Well, if they said exactly the same thing in the same way, you'd wonder, well, are they just simply copying one another? And the fact that they have different perspectives but have a basic core that's the same, I think, lends to the credibility of them. Someone had a hand up over here? No? It's important to understand. So we have the fact that they emphasize different points, different themes, and it's important to recognize that the gospel writers are not always relaying things in strict chronological order. They are recounting things, arranging their material according to their individual emphases and themes. Each gospel writer has certain themes that he is trying to get across. He has an overarching purpose, and he arranges his material in light of that. And so they are not always strictly chronological. You can sort of think of the 4 Gospels as 4 different portraits of the same person, Jesus Christ. They were writing for different audiences. We mentioned that. Someone mentioned that. And we don't want to overemphasize that or overstate this, because the Gospels have been read by a broad spectrum of audiences. But originally, when the author was writing, usually there is a particular group or audience in mind, and that might shape some of his emphases as well, as we'll see. And then the issue of credibility, multiple witnesses, all giving the same testimony, emphasizing maybe some different details, but all giving the same testimony about the uniqueness of the person of Christ, his miracles, his teaching, and then ultimately his death and resurrection. That lends a lot of credibility. When you study some of these other Gospels that we'll talk about, Gnostic Gospels and things like that, they don't show this kind of unified theology that our canonical Gospels do. Notice on your handout, page 94, near the back, and this is basically a comparative chart of the four Gospels. And you can see the probable date of writing, probable place of writing. Notice the last two columns, probable addressees. We'll talk more about this when we get to each Gospel. But you can see there's a little bit of variation there in the target audience of these Gospels, and then the presentation of Jesus Christ. Now, we might not necessarily put it this way, but what this last column highlights is the fact that each Gospel writer has a particular theme, a way of presenting Christ, a portrait of Christ. So this suggests that Matthew is presenting Christ as the Messiah King, the Son of David. And that makes sense if you go back to the previous column. It talks about probable addressees, Jews. And so he's going to emphasize Jesus as Messiah King, Son of David. Mark, servant of Yahweh, the Redeemer, Son of God is a theme in Mark as well. Luke, Son of Man, compassionate, ideal man, and John, Son of God. So you can see the four different portraits that the Gospels give us. Now, as I mentioned, there are a number of scholars who look at these Gospels and they see contradictions because there are differences in details. These are what we would call liberal scholars, which all we mean by that is that they don't accept the Bible, the New Testament, as inspired by God and authoritative. And so they will emphasize, a lot of times, the differences. They will emphasize what appear to be contradictions and not try to harmonize the details. But we have to emphasize the fact that there is a remarkable amount of unity, of agreement between these four portraits of Christ. Yes, there are different emphases, but there are tremendous similarities. And again, when we come to read some of the other Gospels, the other literature that was circulating in, say, the 2nd century, we don't find this kind of unified presentation of Christ. Now, as you study the Gospels, you'll notice that 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar in content, in the way they're structured, sometimes the way events are unfolded. Even the wording sometimes is exactly the same. Whereas John tends to be more unique, more distinct in the kind of material he chooses to include and the way he structures it, the way he presents it. And so because of the similarities of these 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they are often referred to as what? Gospels. Synoptic Gospels. Right. Synoptic, that word is from a Greek word, synopsis, which means a seeing together. Synoptic Gospels. Just one example in terms of the way the books are structured. Matthew, Mark, Luke, the Synoptic Gospels tend to structure the ministry of Jesus in more of a geographical sequence. There's more emphasis on his ministry in Galilee. And then they all move into Caesarea Philippi. What happened in Caesarea Philippi? Do you remember? Ryan? Peter's great confession of Christ. You are the Christ, the Son of God. And that's sort of presented as a turning point, climax, and then from there there's the movement towards Jerusalem. John is not structured in that way. John is structured in a different way. We'll talk about when we come to the Gospel of John. He has what many refer to as the first part of the book of signs, emphasizing the signs that Jesus did. Then there is the book of glory and his movement towards the hour. We'll talk about that more. But all that to illustrate that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are structured very similarly. John is more distinct. In terms of comparison of content, we talked about structure. In terms of content, the synoptics have a lot of material that John actually leaves out. Turn to page 93, turn back a page, I guess, to the chart called Synoptic Parallels. And this lists, the first column lists a number of events that are told in the Gospels, and you can see how Matthew, Mark, and Luke include a lot of these same events or stories or accounts where John leaves a lot of that out, except when you get to the final week and the crucifixion and resurrection. Then all four Gospels recount that material. But notice there's really only one miracle that all four Gospels include. What is it? The feeding of the 5,000. That sounds like a good exam question, doesn't it? What miracle do all four Gospels include? That would be a good exam question. Okay, so this chart simply illustrates for us the similarity of these three Gospels and then the distinct nature of John. Now, John, of course, includes a lot of significant material that the synoptics don't include. One possible explanation for that is John was aware of the synoptic Gospels and he wanted to include some other material that the synoptics did not include. Look at page 95. And this contrasts the synoptics and John. Just look at a couple of these. The synoptics, chiefly concerned with Jesus' ministry in the north around Galilee. John gives more coverage to Jesus' ministry in the south around Judea. Synoptics, much more emphasis on the kingdom of God. John, more emphasis on the person of Christ. Now, the third one, Jesus as Son of David, Son of Man. Jesus especially as Son of God. That's not to say that the synoptics don't teach Jesus as Son of God. The Gospel of Mark in particular emphasizes that. But in terms of comparison, it's more of a major motif or major theme in John. And so you could contrast it with the synoptics that way. So that's just an example of some of the differences between John and the synoptics. Now, because of the similarities between the synoptics, and sometimes it does extend to the very wording of accounts, scholars will talk about the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. Basically, the synoptic problem discusses why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often so similar and yet also show numerous differences. Okay, so you have some very clear similarities, but it's not like they're just repeating one another, because they also emphasize different material and different aspects of a similar account. So there are major similarities, but there are differences as well. By the way, this wasn't considered a problem until the time of the Enlightenment, when you have unbelieving scholars who are approaching these documents and reject them as true, reject them as authoritative or inspired, and they're just using a rational, critical approach to the Gospels. They notice these things and see it as a major problem that you have to deal with. Okay, well, look at the first page of your handout, page 88. This will give you sort of a picture, literally, of what they're talking about here. Most scholars believe Mark was written first, and so that's why Mark is elevated there. You can see 661 verses make up Mark. Of those 661, if you go down to Matthew, the middle portion there, about 500 of those verses, or at least what those verses talk about, are found also in Matthew, the 500 of the 661. So a lot of Mark is repeated in Matthew. Look over at Luke, 350 verses. Okay? You see that? And then look at the bottom. The M box says 333 verses. That's unique material to Matthew. Okay, so only Matthew has that information. You go over to the other column, L, 564 verses are only found in Luke. So that is material unique to Luke. And then you see this other box in the middle, Q. We'll talk about Q in a minute, but 235 verses that are common to Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. You follow all that? Now, just to get an idea of the kinds of material that is unique to the Gospels, turn to page 91 on your handout. And this gives us material, first of all, unique to Matthew. The wise men, for example, and you can go down and see some of the miracles, some of the parables. And then material unique to Mark, you can see that's far less that's unique to Mark. And then over the page, quite a bit unique to Luke. Luke gives us, of course, the lengthiest treatment of the birth of Christ and the preparation, the history behind it, and a number of other material as well. So that just gives you an idea of some of the content that's unique to the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. So the question is, given this first chart again on page 88, and you can see how much material is similar between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Given that fact, the question is, what theory best accounts for the similarities, even at times the exact wording in the synoptics? What's the best explanation for that? Anyone want to venture a guess? What best explains the fact that you have these strong similarities? So sort of a common oral tradition that had been passed down and then gets recorded. Okay, other suggestions? Okay. Ryan's suggestion is all three saw the same thing, heard the same thing, and therefore recorded the same thing. There is some question as to whether Luke was there. Mark maybe heard some things. Some question about whether Luke was really an eyewitness. Matthew certainly. Any other ideas? Okay, so there's conspiracy theory. Okay, well, let's start with inspiration. Does inspiration explain the fact that some of these accounts have identical wording even. Not just that the same account is included in all three Gospels, but the wording is exact. Well, first of all, I want to say, yes, all three Gospels are inspired by God. Absolutely believe that. However, that does not mean that the Gospel writers could not have used sources, because Luke actually tells us he used sources. Turn to the opening chapter of Luke. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Luke says this, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us," notice he's telling us others have written down things about Jesus. So there are other written sources. Verse 2, "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us," so that would suggest Luke was not an eyewitness, right? Because he's getting his account from the eyewitnesses. Verse 3, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." So Luke tells us he's aware of these other writings. He's used them as well as eyewitness testimony to put together his gospel. Okay? So, well, we want to say yes, certainly Luke, as well as Matthew and Mark and John and all of the New Testament, is inspired by God. Nevertheless, Luke tells us he uses other sources, which might explain why at least the wording is identical in some places, as well as the sequencing of material. What about the suggestion that, okay, this was just oral tradition, passed down, common material that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all aware of, and they all recorded it? Well, certainly that is true, that there was an oral tradition passed down, spoken tradition. But the trouble is, Jesus spoke what language primarily? Aramaic. And what language was the New Testament written in? Greek. Now, how many of you have studied another language? Most of you, right? And then you know that there are a number of different ways to translate something into another language. And so the fact that not only the sequencing of the material, but the exact wording in places is identical, would suggest that there was a common written source. Because it's not likely that all three are going to come up with the same wording from a different language. You follow that? The similarities don't just apply to Jesus' teaching, but the order in which events are described, sometimes even parenthetical comments are identical. Let me give you an example here. Oops, forgot that point. Jesus spoke Aramaic. The Gospels were written in Greek. Let me give you an example of where we could look at a number of examples to illustrate the similarities. Let me just give you one between Mark and Matthew. And notice the red letters, the red words are identical wording in Greek. The blue one is the same word, but in a different form in Greek. Okay, so, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Now, that's a parenthetical comment put in by the writer, because Jesus, speaking this, would not have said, let the reader understand. Okay, so the author of the gospel added this. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, that same parenthetical comment is included in Matthew's account of the same event. So identical wording, which would suggest that either Matthew or Mark was drawing upon one another or another common source. You follow that? Okay. So that would suggest then that it's not oral tradition that explains the similarities. They're just the similarities are too close for that to make sense, especially since Jesus spoke in Aramaic and the Gospels were written in Greek. So then the best explanation seems to be that there are common literary sources involved in the synoptics. The Gospel writers were drawing on common literary sources. Look at your chart again on page 88. And here is, as scholars have devoted their lives to studying these things, here's the most common explanation. Okay? And this, by the way, is not just some liberal idea. Many believing scholars think this is how the Gospels were put together. And this illustrates the fact that, yes, God inspired it, but He used historical processes to produce His Word. That's just like when we're led by the Spirit, okay? Yes, we acknowledge that God is sovereign, He is in control, He is at work in us, but that doesn't mean we just sit in the chair and wait for Him to do His work. We have responsibility as well. And that was how God came about inspiring His Word. It was through historical processes. So, Mark is probably the first gospel written. We'll talk about why in a minute, but he's probably the first gospel written. Matthew and Luke have access to Mark. Okay, so they include a number of the accounts, and they use that as a literary source to write their gospels. But what about the fact that Matthew and Luke both have material, and again, sometimes the wording is identical, they have material that Mark leaves out? That would suggest that there was another written source that both Matthew and Luke had access to. And that source we don't have access to today, but scholars have called it Q. Q is from the German word for source. Okay, and then this chart also indicates the material that is unique to Matthew and Luke. Now, turn over to page 89. Now, you don't have to remember all these charts and all the details of this. I'm just going through this to help you understand the so-called synoptic problem, and that it's really not a problem. Okay, so there's the two-source hypothesis, which you can see up here on the screen as well, and that is that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as well as this other source, Q. Now, let me tell you what the Q hypothesis is. It's basically this theory that Matthew and Luke used a common written source. Q tends to focus on, or at least this material that's common to Matthew and Luke, tends to be the sayings of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus. Okay, so apparently the early church had collected a number of these sayings, and it was available in what scholars call this document Q. Okay, another suggestion is a four-source theory, which would just add the unique material from Matthew and Luke, that they were drawing that from other literary sources as well. So, all right, question, does that make sense? Do you follow that? The visuals should help a little bit. Keith? Now, one more question before we move on to something more fun. Okay, I know this is kind of a lot of technical, detailed stuff. But why do scholars think that Mark was written first? Why do scholars think that Mark was written first? Nathaniel? Right, it has the least amount of unique material, so that if the idea is that if Mark was writing after Matthew and Luke, well, why doesn't he include all that good material included in Matthew and Luke? For example, the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. So, why would, if Mark was written last of the Synoptic Gospels, why would he even bother to write a gospel that basically repeats Matthew and Luke and has very little unique content? Now you might say, well, maybe he's writing for people who didn't have access to Matthew and Luke. Well, that's fair. There are other technical reasons, but we don't need to get into those. Okay, now the fun stuff. The 4 Gospels and other Gospels. If you've been paying attention at all to popular media like movies and documentaries on National Geographic or the History Channel, which are, by the way, usually not the most reliable sources when it comes to discussing Christianity, if you didn't know that, or if you see articles at Christmas or Easter on Jesus in Newsweek or Time, or popular level novels like the Da Vinci Code, you'll know that there is a lot of alternative theories and ideas surrounding the person of Christ and the Gospels. There is a lot of discussion about the so-called Gnostic Gospels, or the Gnostic writings. The Gnostic writings are not just made up of Gospels. There are other kinds of writing, other genre included as well, but there are some Gospels. And the Da Vinci Code, we'll talk about the Da Vinci Code not because it's still popular, it sort of has faded away, but nevertheless it is a popular version of what you will see in a number of different other places. Okay, so it's just an easy way to sort of address what liberal scholars or other popular media presents as true. And the Da Vinci Code has some novel claims about the New Testament, and particularly in relation to the Gospels. If you've read the book or if you've seen the movie, you know that one of the characters, the main characters, Lee Teabing, is presented as this expert on history and everything related to church history. This guy is the expert. This is the authority, and he speaks in that kind of way. Well, this guy would fail any church history test he took at Emmaus or anywhere else, because he is a very bad church historian. But let me give you a couple of samples of what he says, particularly in relation to our study today on the Gospels. He says, more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. Among them? I thought those were the only 4. But anyway, Constantine commissioned and financed a new Bible which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike. The earlier Gospels were outlawed, gathered up, and burned. Now notice what he says. The earlier Gospels. So he's suggesting that these other Gospels that give us a different picture of Christ came before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? Fortunately for historians, some of the Gospels that Constantine attempted to eradicate managed to survive. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1450s, hidden in a cave near Qumran in the Judean desert. And of course, the Coptic scrolls in 1945 at Nag Hammadi. These documents speak of Christ's ministry in very human terms. The scrolls highlight glaring historical discrepancies and fabrications, clearly confirming that the modern Bible was compiled and edited by men who possessed a political agenda to promote the divinity of the man Jesus Christ and use his influence to solidify their own power base. Now, that comes to us in a novel, but there are scholars, so-called, who would hold to this kind of view. Are there any statements or issues that you know to be incorrect, that you recognize as you read those things? Okay, good. Dead Sea Scrolls did not contain any Gospels. Ryan? Yeah, okay, so these Coptic writings date much later than is suggested here. Good. Okay, let me highlight a little historical perspective here. Separate fact from fiction. First of all, Constantine did not attempt to eradicate any earlier Gospels, that is, get rid of any earlier Gospels. We have no historical record of that. There's no indication of that. It seems to be just a fictional statement. What is true, what we do know, however, is that in the years before Constantine came to power as an emperor, and the Roman emperor, Christians were severely persecuted, and part of the persecution was burning their scriptures. So, we do know that Christian scriptures were destroyed by the Romans during the time of persecution of Christians. As John mentioned, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't contain any Gospels. They're Jewish, and they're discovered. He's got his dates wrong a number of times, but you don't have to include that. But that's just little things that irritate me. The Dead Sea Scrolls include Old Testament scriptures. They include commentaries on the Old Testament, other Jewish writings, Jewish stories, things like that. But they don't contain any New Testament writings. Another fatal flaw in this argument is the fact that the Gnostic Gospels do not portray Jesus in very human terms. In fact, just the opposite is true. The Gnostic Gospels, or Gnosticism in general, and we'll see this in a minute, but Gnosticism in general denied the real humanity of Christ, made him just godlike, which completely undermines the whole thesis of the Da Vinci Code. And finally, the Church, Vatican is the wrong term. The Vatican does not exist as the residence of the Pope until the 14th century. But anyway, the Vatican had nothing to do, the Church had nothing to do with covering up document discoveries. And there's all kinds of other errors with the Da Vinci Code. So if you read that and had your faith shaken, don't, because it is historically false. All right. Wait. Okay. What about these other Gospels, though? What about the other Gospels that are mentioned in the Da Vinci Code and in many other places, they really did exist, really do exist, at least copies of them. We do have access to other Gospels, other writings. And let me just say a word about Gnosticism and the Gnostic Gospels. Gnosticism was a heresy that flourished in the about the 2nd to 3rd century, 2nd to 4th. You could date it to the 4th century, and there are all kinds of different variations and forms that go under this broad category of Gnosticism. But there are some key similarities. And one of the key similarities is they viewed the physical world, the material things in the world, as inherently evil. And in contrast, it's only the spirit that is good, the spiritual realm that is good. Now, one way that this worked itself out practically, this idea, is some Gnostics would say, okay, therefore we have to live very ascetic lives. That is very strict, kind of legalistic, no self-indulgence with the flesh, and because that's evil, that corrupts us. Others say, well, the physical is evil. It's not the real realm. It's not the good realm. So it doesn't matter what you do physically. It doesn't matter. What really counts is the spiritual. So that's one variation within this broad idea of Gnosticism. One way they worked out their ideas. Sometimes, just before we get to that point, well, you can write it down, but before I get to that, their soteriology, another common view then was that there are two different kinds of gods. There's the God who created matter or the world, and then there's this transcendent God who is completely removed from the created order. And the way that works out is the God of creation is a bad God. He's an evil deity. Why? Exactly, because he's responsible for the physical world, which is inherently evil. And so they would often view the God of the Old Testament, Marcion, for example, we talked about Marcion, he viewed the God of the Old Testament as bad, and that's why we get rid of the Old Testament. Okay, salvation is by secret knowledge. The Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. That's thus Gnosticism. That's where that term comes from. And this is another common idea. Basically, salvation, ultimate salvation comes when you escape the physical. You are there's a divine spark, a divine spiritual spark trapped inside of certain people, not everyone, not the common people. Gnosticism was kind of an elitist cult. It was for the informed. Okay, and so if you were in this group, you had a divine spark within you, and salvation comes when you're released from that. You're released and reunited with the Great Spirit in the sky or wherever he is. Okay, and so the secret knowledge is not only that, but also recognizing this basic duality that the physical is evil, the spiritual is good, and so you focus on what is spiritual and you reject everything that's physical, or it's indifferent. Now, these ideas don't get fully worked out really until the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There is some beginning forms of these ideas in the New Testament times, and we'll come to that as we work through some of the New Testament material, but that is called proto-Gnosticism or incipient Gnosticism, which simply means the developing ideas of Gnosticism are sometimes combated in the New Testament. We'll come to that later, so don't worry about that now. But Christians oppose Gnosticism. Very clearly, Christians oppose Gnosticism. There is this new school of thought that sometimes shows up in the Da Vinci Code and scholars like Bart Ehrman that says you can't talk about orthodoxy and heresy in these early centuries. There's just different brands of Christianity, and not one is the right way. They're all just different ways of following Jesus. Well, that's not how the early church thought. And so they oppose Gnosticism. A guy by the name of Irenaeus, early church father, wrote a major work called Against Heresies, and basically what he was thinking of the different schools of Gnosticism. We didn't have a whole lot of access to all of these documents, the Gnostic writings, until we had access to some, but some of our knowledge of Gnosticism really came from works like Irenaeus' Against Heresies, because he was refuting it, and that's where we learned about it. But there was an important discovery, the Nag Hammadi discovery, that is mentioned in the Da Vinci Code. However, the Da Vinci Code calls this, the documents included in this discovery, the earliest Christian records. The earliest Christian records. Nag Hammadi, by the way, is just an Egyptian village where these documents were discovered. And so the impression you get is these documents really give us the truth about Jesus Christ. The canonical Gospels, they're later. They're used by Constantine for his political agenda. These are the ones that give us the truth about Jesus and Christianity. Is that true? No. No. All scholars, almost all scholars, except the very loopiest, craziest, the least credible, like the Jesus Seminar people, all scholars, even those who don't believe the New Testament, who don't believe it's inspired by God, nevertheless, all scholars will tell you that the Gnostic writings were written between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Whereas, even again, most of these liberal scholars will date the New Testament documents in the 1st century. Many of these are what we would call forgeries. That's not probably the best term. The more technical term is pseudepigrapha, false writings. That is, they're written, for example, in the name of a New Testament figure like Peter or Thomas, but not written by Thomas. So they're false writings in that sense. And there is only a handful of these Gospels, not 80. One of the things you should do if anyone ever challenges you about the Gnostic Gospels being the true, telling us the truth about Jesus, is just challenge someone to read both. Read the canonical Gospels and then read the Gnostic Gospels, and you decide, because there is a vast difference between these two in terms of content. Most of the Gnostic writings are sort of cryptic. That is, they're this kind of hidden meaning, because secret knowledge and all this kind of stuff. So you read a lot of these writings, and it's basically incoherent. And some of what it does say is just crazy. Let me give you an example. One of the most famous celebrated ones is called the Gospel of Thomas. Okay? Let me give you a sample of the Gospel of Thomas. Simon Peter said to them, the disciples and Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Ouch! Now, the ironic thing about this is that the Da Vinci Code celebrates the Gospel of Thomas, but also is trying to promote what it calls the sacred feminine, as if we really need to get back to this sacred feminine. Well, so much for the sacred feminine, huh? Yeah, so there is a little bit of irony in there. I've given the very last page on your handout are some statements by early church fathers, just illustrating a couple of things. First of all, their rejection of the Gnostic writings, and also their defending of the four Gospels. So we won't take time to read that, but there it is for your reference if you're interested to hear firsthand what these early church writers were saying about Gnosticism as well as the canonical Gospels. Now, I want to read you a few more examples just to give you kind of a flavor, if I can use that word, a flavor for what these Gnostic Gospels and Gnostic writings were like. Okay? And this will illustrate how the canonical Gospels rise so far above these other writings. They're incomparable, really. So let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, I'm going to read... Dean Glock just walked in. I better not do this. He might get me in trouble because I'm going to read something from a book called The Second Treatise of the Great Seth. Yeah. But rest assured, we're not having our devotions from the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. Okay? But this will illustrate to you a key difference between Gnosticism and Orthodoxy, and that is their view of the cross, their view of the death of Jesus. They don't believe Jesus, or whoever he was, and they have different ideas about that, but that he really died on the cross. Because many of them had a Christology which denied the true humanity of Christ, because the flesh is inherently evil. The material is evil. So this Christ could not have really been human. So listen to how the great Seth describes the cross. Now, this is Jesus speaking. Another, their father, was the one who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. Again, this is Jesus speaking. So another did that. They were hitting me with the reed. Another was the one lifted up the cross on his shoulders, who was Simon. Another was the one on whom they put the crown of thorns. But I was rejoicing in the height over all the riches of the archons and the offspring of their error and conceit. I was laughing at their ignorance. All their powers I brought into subjection. For when I came down, no one saw me, for I kept changing my forms above, transforming from appearance to appearance. And on account of this, when I was at their gates, I kept taking their likeness, for I passed them by quietly. And I was viewing the places, and I did not fear, nor was I ashamed, for I was undefiled. That is, I wasn't really flesh like they were. So, very different view of the cross and the person of Christ, which shows you how different this cult was. Now, let me read you something from the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. Okay, again, a different view of the cross. O Peter, come therefore, let us proceed to the completion of the will of the undefiled Father. That is, not the Creator, but the undefiled Father, the transcendent one. For behold, those who will bring judgment upon themselves are coming, and they will put themselves to shame, but me they cannot touch. And you, O Peter, will stand in their midst. Do not be afraid because of your cowardice. Their minds will be closed, for the invisible one has opposed them. When he had said those things, I saw him apparently being seized by them, and I said, What am I seeing, O Lord? Is it you yourself whom they take? And are you holding on to me? Who is this one above the cross who is glad and laughing? And is it another person whose feet and hands they are hammering? The Savior said to me, He whom you see above the cross, glad and laughing, is the living Jesus. But he into whose hands and feet they are driving the nails is his physical part, which is the substitute. They are putting to shame that which is his likeness. But look at him and look at me." So again, a very different view of the cross. And that affects salvation. Christ didn't really die on the cross. And if that's true, according to Paul, we're still in our sins if he didn't rise from the dead as well. Just a little side note here. Islam also denies that Jesus died on a cross. And when Jay Smith was here, if those of you remember him from last semester, he was suggesting that actually Muslim or Muhammad and others who put together the Quran only had access to these kinds of Gnostic writings, not necessarily the canonical Gospels, and that's why one reason you have the view of the cross in Islam that you do. Just one more sample. This comes from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and this is pretty hilarious. It tries to fill in the hidden years. You know, in the canonical Gospels, we hear about Jesus as a baby, as a young child, and then basically his ministry as an adult. Well, this Gospel, Gnostic writing, tries to fill in some of those holes and tell us what Jesus was like when he was just a boy. And here's some of the stories. Somewhat later, he was going through the village, and a child ran up and banged into his shoulder. Jesus was aggravated and said to him, "You will go no further on your way." And right away the child fell down and died. Some of those who saw what happened said, "Where was this child born? For everything he says is a deed accomplished." The parents of the dead child came to Joseph and blamed him, saying, "Since you have such a child, you cannot live with us in the village. Or teach him to bless and not to curse, for he is killing our children." Joseph called to the child and admonished him privately. "Why are you doing such things? These people are suffering. They hate us and are persecuting us." But Jesus replied, "I know these are not your words, and so I also will keep silent for your sake. But those others will bear their punishment." And immediately those who were accusing him were blinded. Those who saw these things were frightened and disturbed. They began saying about him, "Everything he has said, whether good or bad, has become an amazing reality." When Joseph saw what Jesus had done, he rose up, grabbed his ear, and yanked him hard. The child was irritated and said to him, "It is enough for you to seek and not find. You have not acted at all wisely. Do you not know that I am yours? Do not grieve me." And there are other stories about crazy stories. We'll have to stop there. But it kind of gives you the picture of young Jesus as. Did you ever see that movie, The Incredibles? And there's that little nasty kid. It's kind of the picture that this presents of Jesus. So again, compare the canonical Gospels with these writings, and the canonical Gospels inevitably rise to the top.